close your eyes for a moment. Let the modern world slowly drift away. The hum of machines, the ringing of phones, the never-ending demands. Let them fade like mist blown off by the wind. Take a slow breath and allow your body to release a tension you never knew clung to the back of your neck. Now imagine yourself standing inside an old church. The ceiling is high and dim. Sunlight slips through stained glass windows, painting the stone floor in blood red and sea blue reflections. The air inside is damp and still, as if time itself refuses to move. Among the scent of burning candles and centuries-old dust, something unspoken lingers. A whisper not from any living mouth, but one that rises from the walls, from the pillars, from the floor worn slick with age. This is a place of prayer, of confession, of hope for wandering souls. But beneath this floor, hidden from view, lies a secret not every priest knows. Even the church caretakers inherit only a whisper of a hint, passed down in half-dead Latin murmurs. A wound passed through generations that must never be exposed. But tonight, we will begin to open it. Not with crowbars or chisels, but with a soft imagination and eyes kept firmly closed. Imagine the stone floor shifting slightly, revealing a cramped chamber untouched by light. The air is stale inside. The earth is moist, carrying the scent of aged flesh and dead lime. And there are carvings, old, faint, not from early Christianity, but further back, darker still, perhaps from a time when people still believed in forest spirits and blood offerings. This is where our journey begins. Not as archaeologists, not as historians with scrolls, but as silent observers, passengers of time, who simply want to know, and perhaps, slowly, remember something that was long buried. Now imagine yourself in a small village in northern France. In the year 1311, it lies far from the castles of the nobility and the trade routes of merchants. Only fields of wheat, marshes reeking of rotting mud, and fog that descends almost every morning. The villagers call this place Saint Benut, though maps from that century rarely mention it. The harvest failed, rain fell in the wrong months. Disease began to spread from the cities, striking down young bodies before they could grow old. And in the middle of it all, the church remained. People came, knelt, wept, hoped. But they did not know that every time they touched their forehead to the church floor, they were bowing above a chamber that held something that was never meant to be found. There is nothing extraordinary here, except for a stone church with an old bell that rings 3 times a day, and a cemetery behind it that is never without a fresh grave. The year 1311 is not a golden age in European history. It is a time when the land began to crack from long droughts and villagers' stomachs grew familiar with emptiness. Not far from here, the great churches were busy recording scenes and confessions. But in Saint Benut, life unfolded without record, without praise, without official history. Only life, death, and something slowly growing underground. Older than doctrine, older than prayer. Imagine yourself walking down the muddy road toward that church. Your shoes are wet, the air cuts into your bones. The church wall is cold beneath your fingers. The stones that built it were taken from the ruins of a Roman temple that once stood nearby. looted stone by stone by a 10th century priest who wished to bring light to this village. But the light never fully arrived. Behind the altar, in a small back room where the monks store wine and sacramental bread, there is a tiny door that always remains locked. No visible key, no reason for anyone to ask. Even the children are taught never to play near that wall. It is said that some priests vanished after praying too long in that room, but no searches were ever made. Only prayers and forgetting. The condition of the times was fear, not of war, but of a world that seemed to stop responding. Imagine waking up on a damp morning. The straw you sleep on is still wet from the night before. Your roof leaks and dew drips like mist through the cracks in the rotting wood. There is no food, not yet, and no clean water. Torn at the shoulder, ash stains near the bottom from a fall you took carrying a bucket. You do not think about how you look. There is no mirror in your home. No one cares if you are clean, only if you can work. If the weather turns and the rain falls, the day becomes darker. But it is not the dark that frightens you. It is the damp stench that seeps into your skin, and the sound of rats in the ceiling searching for leftover grain. You know today will be like the day before, but something is different. Beneath the church, a chamber has started to exhale warm air since yesterday. And last night, you thought you heard a sound like splintering wood, even though no trees had fallen. Maybe a large rat. Maybe something else. The bucket in the corner is only half full, drawn last night from the well near the church. The water is cloudy, but better than the river, which often carries the carcasses of pigs or dogs from upstream. No one knows who pollutes it, only whispers that the monks dump embalming waste into the stream under cover of night. But whispers do not fill stomachs. You take a sip, just enough to wet your throat. The day will be long. You must be at the churchyard before the sun climbs too high. There, you sweep the grounds and sometimes help dig in the back, where new graves are made. Sometimes strange smells seep from certain cracks in the earth, like sulfur and rusted metal. But the priests say it is only the scent of death. And everyone knows that death is always close. There are no glass windows, only burlap covering holes in the wall to block the wind. You pull on a thin wool cloak, a gift from your mother when you were small. Now it is too short, but still your only source of warmth. Outside, the rooster has not yet crowed, but the sky is beginning to shift. A new day in St. Benut does not begin with prayer or hope, but with an empty stomach and the need to survive. In the corner of the room, your sister shivers, her cough dry and long. You share this tiny space with two other siblings and your mother still asleep. Your father died long ago. The village says he fell into the river while carrying stones for the church wall, and his body was never found. You sit up slowly, feet touching the cold, hard earth. The clothes you wear today are the same as yesterday. As you walk toward the churchyard, the ground remains soft and soggy, holding the footprints of the night before. There are no cobbled paths, only earth that sometimes sinks to your ankles, forcing you to pause and tug your worn leather shoes whose soles are nearly detached. Their smoke mixes with the mist, creating a thin film that clings to your skin like powder. They rarely speak, only sneezing now and then from the dust rising into the air as they shake out sleeves and chest cloths. They are not afraid. They have lived too long near death to find its scent unusual. You do not know who is to be buried today. There is no ceremony, only a hole. And tonight, another body will arrive, carried from the village, lost to flood. They say he was a sinner. But they call everyone a sinner if they die without enough money. The rich are buried inside the church. The poor out here. The very poor, without even a marker. One of them, the oldest, once said this place used to be a pagan temple long before the church was built. That the ground holds something older than the cross, but no one believes her. Or maybe they do and choose silence. There another boy your age, Benut, is digging a new hole. He does not look up at you. He is too busy avoiding the bone fragments he just struck from an older grave. Here, not all the dead are buried in coffins. Some are simply wrapped in cloth, and if they weren't important, the graves are reused. There are no records of who once lay beneath. Only dry bones, sometimes still wearing rings, or the remnants of braided hair preserved in the earth. The morning air carries the scent of salted meat and the sharp bite of iron from the blacksmith's forge just waking its fire. But the strongest smell still comes from the back of the church, where fresh graves are being dug. The old priest they call Brother Amori stands near the fence, his face never smiling. He does not greet you. He only nods, pointing to the pile of shovels and picks. You know what it means. Start working. No need for words. You pass by the outer altar, where dim candles still burn from last night's mass. Nearby, a group of old women sit on a long bench, tearing fabric from the clothes of the dead to be used again. You pick up a shovel and begin digging where you were told. The soil is strange, too red, too light, as if once burned. And the deeper you dig, the more you smell something unfamiliar. Not the rot of decay, nor the musk of wet earth, but something metallic and hot, like scorched blood. But Brother Amori never allows anyone to stop. If you talk too much, you'll be sent to the monastery fields, which they say are worse. There, you plant vegetables with no water, and many who go there never return. The day passes without conversation. Only the sound of shovels, the flutter of cloth, and sometimes the gnawing of rats on coffin wood. At an unusual depth, roughly at waist height, your shovel strikes something hard, but it is not stone. The shape feels too flat, too clean. You do not speak. You simply look at each other. Then you bury it again, not from fear, but from not knowing what else to do. There is no place in your mind that can explain an object like that. The discovery is never mentioned again. But that day, the monks do not emerge from their monastery. Even the morning bell is not rung. The church remains open, but the inner altar door is locked. Villagers begin to ask questions, but only in whispers. No one dares knock on the monastery door. Not even Brother Amori is seen that afternoon. You have never seen anything like it in a church, in a noble's house, or even in the marketplace. But the scraping of metal and something like stone dragged across tile. You peek from afar, but the church windows are covered with thick cloth. The light inside is red. You have never seen such a light. Not from fire, not from candles. It does not flicker. It remains still, like an eye glowing in the dark. It seems like it came from another world, something that should not exist here. You pause and signal to Banut without a word, just a hand gesture. He walks over and peers into the pit, then frowns. You begin brushing away the surrounding soil with your hands, slowly, careful not to damage the object. Gradually, its surface becomes visible. It is not bone, not wood, not iron, but some sort of gleaming material. Like pottery, but far too smooth. Its color is deep black, unlike anything from this century. There is a strange pattern on one side, like an unfamiliar carving. Not a cross, not a church symbol, not swirling lines and a shape like an open eye. Banut takes it from your hands, turns it over, then quickly sets it down as if afraid to hold it too long. After that, you do not dig deeper. You dig a new hole beside it and pretend nothing was ever there. No one asks questions. Brother Amori never inspects the pits. He only wants the grave ready before sundown. But that night, you cannot sleep. Your eyes remain open even as you lie down. In the darkness, you remember the patterns on that object. You try to trace them into the dirt with your finger, but you cannot recall them clearly. Only one shape keeps returning to your thoughts. A circle. Empty at the center, but pointing toward something, like a mouth. The next day, when you return to the same spot, the hole has been completely filled, not by you, but by someone who came in the night. The soil is packed and even. Too even. There is a small mark at the center, a round stone left on top. Not a gravestone, just an ordinary rock. But from its color and shape, you know it is not from the churchyard. There are no round stones here, only soil and bone. You say nothing. Banut says nothing. At night, sounds echo from within the church, not the songs of Mass. At dawn, the village of St. Banut appears normal. Cattle graze, roosters crow, and a few traders set up their stalls in the small square. Yet hidden beneath this routine is a subtle unease. Children stifle their laughter, adults bow their heads more often, and in the corner of the church, the monks busily board up every side door with fresh planks as if trying to keep something contained. Brother Amori himself paces the inner courtyard, staring down at the freshly filled earth. His face is somber, his eyes bloodshot from apparent sleeplessness. He speaks to no one. Even his morning prayers falter, as if his tongue is caught in his throat. Behind the monastery, you notice a small iron door once concealed behind heavy black drapes now, sealed shut with a massive padlock. No one passes through it. Even Julian, a young monk you know well, looks terrified as he approaches. He closes his eyes, as though warding off something unseen, then runs swiftly away from the church grounds. The village has never seen a monk run. That day, you find something unusual while sweeping the floor of the confessional room. Behind an old wooden column near the alms box lies a crumpled piece of paper, as if it had fallen there unnoticed. It is unsealed, unfolded, and almost deliberately abandoned. You pick it up gently, and your eyes begin to scan the faded ink. The handwriting is shaky and hurried, but still legible. It is not a prayer, not a love letter, but a long confession, seemingly written by someone who knew they were running out of time. It speaks of an underground room that appears on no map. It mentions an old door, now double-locked, and it speaks of whispers. At night, it says, voices can be heard from behind the altar wall. Unclear, but not in Latin, nor are they prayers. Sometimes it sounds like a crying infant. Sometimes, like someone calling from deep underground. The letter's author claims that years ago, a stonemason died suddenly after digging too deep beneath the church. His body was never properly buried. No funeral mass. Just vanished. After that, the monks began to change. Their voices grew quieter, their smiles rarer. Imagine that night when the whole village was already asleep and only the dim glow of an oil lantern still trembled in a corner of the wall. You decide to return to the church alone. Something in the contents of that letter refuses to let you rest. But with each passing day, curiosity and dread grow together. Who carved those symbols? Why are strange sounds heard only from behind the altar? And why was that letter left so carelessly, as if waiting to be found? The priest never mentions anything about an underground room. But when you ask the village elders, they only lower their gaze and answer with the same phrase. There are things better left unfound, they say. There are doors that should never be opened again. Your footsteps echo slowly on the cold stone floor, the sound like another set of steps mirroring yours. As you reach the altar, you notice a tiny gap beneath the carving of the ancient cross, not merely a crack from age. Beneath it, you find patterns etched into the stone that appear intentional. Symbols you do not recognize from any mass, nor are they part of any official liturgy. There are spirals, crossing lines, and letters that don't fit the Latin alphabet. You touch the carved surface, brushing away some dust. Suddenly, a row of marks appears. A code that points to a hidden place. You return home that night in silence, afraid to speak of what you found, even to your own wife. Weeks pass, and the peace of the church slowly becomes something unsettling. A strange smell begins to linger, faint, like forgotten meat in a damp room. Sometimes there are knocks, as if someone is calling from within the walls. A family living near the church moves away after their daughter begins talking in her sleep, mentioning names no one had ever taught her. She speaks of a door and stone and eyes. The priest says it's just a dead rat, and a young man is ordered to inspect beneath the altar. In the dream, you stand in a narrow room with walls made of bone. But no workers come, no hammering, clouds of dust, only heavy black curtains hung at the main doors. No one is allowed in, not even the night watchman. And on each bone, a name is carved, but none sound like the name of saints. Some believe there is a secret chamber beneath that was accidentally reopened. Others are certain that the priest has found something that challenges even their own faith. But no one dares to ask directly, because in a village like this, asking can be just as dangerous as knowing. but nothing is found. Yet the smell doesn't leave. It lingers like a memory that refuses to fade. The nights grow heavier. People claim to hear footsteps inside the church. Even though the doors are locked, you too begin to dream of stairs that descend deep into the earth and a sound like dripping water, never stopping. One morning, the priest gathers the congregation and announces that the church will close temporarily for renovation. People begin to whisper that the church hides something no one should see. On a damp afternoon, with dew clinging to the stone walls like shy sweat, a dog began barking endlessly at the church. There was nothing there. No movement, no sound. But the dog didn't stop. It clawed the dirt with its paws, growled at the air. Then, suddenly, it went silent, stared blankly, and ran toward the hills as if chased by something unseen. But that night, the smell was different, like rusted iron, like blood. People shut their windows early. Fires and hearths were kept burning through the night. An old woman whispered that it was the scent of the past, never properly buried. And by morning, someone had drawn a strange symbol on the ground in white chalk. The shape was unfamiliar, like an eye turned upside down, or a key that had lost its door. No one dared erase it. Not even the rain would wash it away. The next day, two young men tried to peek into the church through a back window, but the glass had been painted black from the inside. One of them used a small knife to scrape off some of the paint and opened a slit the size of a finger. He saw something, but he couldn't explain. He just went silent, his face pale, and didn't speak a word to anyone for 3 days. That night, the wind blew from the north. It usually carried the scent of damp earth and old wood. Then cracks began to appear on the church floor. They spread like veins from the center of the altar. No one saw them form directly, but a stonemason who once worked there before the church closed said the stone beneath the altar had changed color, as if it had been burned from within, as if it was holding something that wanted to come out. On the third night, the church bell rang on its own. Once, twice, then silence. No one claimed to have pulled the rope. 3 days after the bell rang on its own, a carpenter named Mahoud finally gathered the courage to enter the church. He did not go out of curiosity, but because of a dream that had haunted him every night. In his sleep, he always saw a veiled woman standing at the altar, pointing downward. She said nothing, only pointed, her eyes blank, her clothes soaked as if pulled from a river. That morning, Mahoud brought a lantern and a small wooden cross, merely to calm his nerves. The stairs were slippery, and cold air rose from below. The walls were damp. On the right side, there were etchings. Every fold, every wrinkle, down to the toenails, perfectly detailed. Around the chamber were stone seats, like small altars facing the center. And behind each seat, faces were carved into the wall. But none had eyes. Their sockets were empty, and all the faces stared directly at the wax figure in the center, as if waiting for it to move, as if they had once seen it awaken. Mahoud stepped closer. His heart pounded so loud it echoed in his ears. But the wax figure did not move, did not breathe. It just lay there, as if waiting for someone to wake it. Human figures split down the middle, with mouths on their bellies and eyes on their palms. The deeper he went, the stranger the drawings became. The church door opened easily, despite rumors that it had been nailed shut from the outside. The air inside felt frozen. No dust, no sound. But the scent of damp earth seemed to rise from between the floor tiles. He lit his lantern and walked slowly to the altar. There, exactly where the woman in his dream had pointed, he saw a tile unlike the others. Slightly darker, its cracks formed a circular pattern. He tapped it gently with the handle of his knife. The smell that rose from it was immediate. Not rot, not decay, but like burned paper and rancid oil. Mahout held his lantern over the edge and saw smooth carved walls, inscribed with writings he did not recognize. He could not read them, but he knew they weren't Latin, nor Persian. The sound was different, hollow, like tapping on an empty coffin. Mahout began to pry at the edge, and within an hour he had lifted the tile entirely. What opened was not a small hole, but the mouth of a steep stone staircase descending into the earth. Despite the tremor in his limbs, he stepped down. 1 step, 2 steps. He thought of turning back, but when he looked up, the light from his lantern seemed swallowed by the walls. The way out felt gone. He continued downward. His footsteps were swallowed by the air, and finally he reached a chamber. It was round, with 8 supporting pillars. In the center, there was a stone table, and lying on that table was a body. Not rotting, not bleeding, just asleep. But the body was entirely made of wax. He placed the lantern on the floor. The light revealed more. In that stone chamber, Mahout sat on the floor. He did not know whether he had been still for 5 minutes or 5 hours. Time seemed halted, like a clock without a tick. There were markings, long scratches, deep and spiraling, encircling the column as if something had tried to escape. He touched it. The pillar's surface felt warm. It made no sense. No fire, no heat source. But the stone pulsed faintly. The sound came from the stone table at the center. Not from the wax figure, but beneath it. Shaped like an eye, with a spiral at its center. In that moment, every carved face on the wall seemed to exhale in unison. Not loudly, but enough to raise the hairs on his neck. The wax figure still lay motionless. But Mahout knew he had triggered something. The talisman was cold. But the moment he touched it, a voice entered his ears. Not loud, just a whisper. Each step seemed to pull the walls closer. He shut his eyes, hoping to wake. But this was not a dream, and the whispers now filled his mind. There was no sound, yet the silence itself spoke. The chamber was alive, but not as a place. It was a mouth waiting to close, and Mahout was already inside it. Not in a language he knew, but it felt like a command. Something was scratching from the other side of the floor. Not fast, not loud, but continuous. Like someone writing. With a nail, Mahout held his breath, fearing even that might alert it, as if it breathed. The lantern on the floor still burned, but its light felt heavy, as though revealing something that did not wish to be seen. The wax figure remained unmoved, Yet Mahoud felt watched, not by the sculpture, not by the eyeless carvings, but by something without form. He began speaking to himself, softly, whispering, just to be sure his voice still existed. But no echo returned. His words were absorbed by the walls. Even his breathing felt stolen by the air. Every step he took sank like it was swallowed in mud. This wasn't merely a secret chamber. It was another world, disguised beneath the known one. Slowly, he stood and approached one of the pillars. Mahoud took a deep breath. He wanted to return, but the stairway was gone. He turned and saw only a sealed wall, solid, seamless. He had heard no collapse, had seen nothing shift. But the way out had vanished, and in that silence, something was heard, like a breeze, but patterned. He pressed himself against the wall. Then he saw something, a small object under the table. He crawled forward and picked it up. A talisman made of dark green metal. He dropped it instantly. It rolled and stopped at the feet of the wax figure. He stepped back, but the room did not feel larger. Mahoud didn't know what else to do but sit and wait. But he wasn't the first to stand in that room. He began noticing the details around him, the same symbol he had seen on the talisman and at the base of the pillar. As though everything in this room had once belonged to a single, interrupted ritual. These items, their circular carvings spiraled toward the center, ending with a figure that looked vaguely human, but with its head merged with flame. The figure was surrounded by faces and tears. All carvings faced downward, toward the wax body at the room's center. Or perhaps guarding it. They weren't random remnants. They were once owned by people who also descended here. In the corner, almost untouched by light, was a small pile of rusted metal objects. But 2, 3, then 10. Mahoud didn't move. He knew if he rose, something would know he was awake. Tiny, but enough for the lantern's glow to peek inside. He moved closer, slowly, and he saw an eye. Not human, motionless, but open, staring directly at him from unfathomable depth. The eye burned like black stone holding fire. And Mahoud knew, somehow, that the eye had not just opened. It had been waiting for someone to look back. But if he stayed, the sound would come closer. He was trapped between fear and curiosity. But clearly, they were human. He discovered a finger bone still wearing a silver ring. He had no idea why the ring had not rusted. He looked at the walls and saw faint etchings, like notes. In Old Latin, he could make out one phrase clearly. Nan redibus. You will not return. But it wasn't something he wanted to explore further. He moved slowly and found buckles, knife hilts, and scraps of rotting leather shoes. All of them ancient. The leather nearly crumbled like ash. He picked up a blade and saw the same spiral eye symbol etched into it. About kings who locked something away and never explained why. About churches not built to worship, but to seal. This wasn't a holy site. It was a prison, but not for any man. He began to count and found more than one pile, each with remains of personal belongings. Most were destroyed beyond recognition. He sat again and stared at the ceiling. But like before, his voice vanished into stone. No echo, no response. He struck the wall. No vibration, no sound. As if the wall was older than the world itself. Mahoud began to think about all the absurd stories in history, about priests who vanished. And those objects, they weren't relics, they were proof. Proof that people kept coming out of curiosity or command. And they all ended here. His stomach turned. He wanted to leave. But there was no door. He tried to shout. In the silence, the sound beneath the table returned. Louder now, like nails scraping through stone. Not one. A small crack opened in the floor. The floor began to tremble softly. Barely noticeable, yet enough to send dust from the lantern trickling down like grains in an hourglass. Mahoud pulled back from the crack, his eyes still fixed below, still watching that eye. Until his eyelids grew heavy not from sleep, but from something else. A pull, a slow internal draw, as if his mind was being summoned downward, back to a time before this place was called a church. The walls shifted in his vision. Stone became wood. Wood became clay. He saw the same pillars, but no crosses. He could see more inscriptions, clearly left by different hands across different centuries. But that word no longer comforted Mahoud. He knew that forever was a human invention. Time here did not obey clocks or sunlight. In this place, time waited for the will of something older than seasons or empires. An ancient will without body, capable of living within anyone who looked too long into that eye. The lantern did not flicker, yet its shadows danced like water. Mahoud knew his time was limited. He had to decide whether to flee this place and bear the weight of knowledge forever, remain here, and become part of the unwritten history. And that was why no one returned, not because they died, but because they changed. Some scratched with nails, some written in blood, some in Latin, some in Arabic, and some just jagged symbols. But all with the same warning: do not awaken. The first phrase was faint, like a leftover dream. But Mahoud understood. Do not open. Do not look. Do not listen. No holy symbols. Only spirals and a group of robed figures standing in a circle. Their faces unclear, but their hands raised in unison. But not just sound. Mahoud smelled the scent of burned flesh, though there was no fire. He was in tea, sure if it was real or merely the echo of a ritual now repeating itself. In the center, a hole opened like a yawning mouth. From it, a voice not human whispered with a sound of wind bearing thousands of words, none of them intelligible. Then darkness, and Mahoud returned to his body. He realized he had never truly been alone. Not since stepping into this church, something had accompanied him. Not always near, but always present. Something that had been sealed for so long that the boundary between time and will had blurred. He began to wonder, who sealed this room first, and why? He moved along the wall again. One phrase kept appearing in multiple languages. Dormit usque, eternum. It sleeps until forever. He sat again at the center of the room. Slowly, The waxen figure lying there began to crack, a soft noise like melting ice echoing faintly. He began to feel that what had been sealed here wasn't merely a creature, but a consciousness. In the corner of the room, shadows moved independently. But when he stood, the voice greeted him. Not with sound, but in his mind. You have seen. So you must choose. Among all the silence, the voice inside his mind felt the most real. He stood at the edge of choice, and the world seemed to stop spinning, waiting for his decision. No thunder, no dramatic effect. Leave this place, wash his hands clean, and write a report filled only with rhetoric and neutral statements. But Mahout knew that if he chose that, he would never truly be the same. He would carry the burden of knowing, and the world outside would feel ... too bright, too shallow. Just silence absolute and complete, like the space between two heartbeats. Perhaps he would witness a transformation. Perhaps he would become part of the cycle. People coming and going, buildings changing, but something enduring below. Every few generations, someone always found the crack, but none of them would know that Mahout was not lost. He had simply become part of something that had waited a long time, and now it was his turn to wait. And each time, history recorded it as madness. He smelled wet earth and heard faint footsteps, though he knew he was alone. He did not know if he would die or live in another form, but he knew one thing: he would not forget. And because he would not forget, he would not leave. Something was approaching not physically, but through a layer deeper than ordinary senses. Or perhaps, as the voice in his mind had said, he would become a vessel. He wanted to know that curiosity had never faded. He opened his notebook, but instead of writing, he drew a circle, then an eye in its center, then patterns ones he hadn't realized matched the carvings on the wall. No one could explain what would happen if he stayed. But one thing felt certain: he would not emerge the same man. As though information no longer needed to be read or heard, only felt. He understood why this place had been sealed. Not out of fear of a creature, but fear of knowledge. What lay beneath this church was not just a body, but a record. A trace of belief older than any religion we now know. The first choice felt simple. Leave, climb back up through the narrow stone stairs, seal the hidden door again, and bury all the knowledge he had just uncovered. The second choice was no simpler. He could remain, sit on the cold floor, and wait for something to happen. Wait for the wax to fully crack. He looked at his hands, which trembled softly, as though the blood inside them were deciding its own direction. Mahout sat again, not out of surrender, but to listen more closely. He knew his mind was beginning to connect with something. Not possession, but connection. He began to see the town above the church, the past rushing by. Mahout closed his eyes. He allowed his mind to be drawn gently, not surrendering, just ... flowing. Up there in the world above, people would wonder where he had gone. They would assume he had vanished in the ruins. Investigations would be opened, new teams sent. Let us imagine that time, like water flowing gently over ancient stones, does not always move in one direction. There are pools where the past lingers, settling with dust and the remnants of whispers from souls long forgotten. The man carved into the walnut with tools, but with his bleeding fingers. The symbols he etched came from no known culture. Yet somehow, Mahood understood their meaning. Beneath that church, Mahood began to feel the pulse of those who had once waited. Those who had once sat in the same place, breathing quietly, eyes open or closed, their minds slowly unmoored from human form. He saw a ragged man from the 15th century. His hair was long, his eyes empty, yet his body remained upright, as if something within held him firm. A small space beneath the altar, absent from blueprints, unmentioned in Scripture. The voices of those who had merged with stone and wall. His memory of the outside world began to feel like a dream he had once written down, then forgotten. The world above, though slowly, would be affected by this place's presence. Because every thought that diverged from a straight line would flow back to this knot. Every unanswered question, every hidden doubt, all would find their way back here. He was not afraid. He only understood that he was changing, not dying, not living. Becoming voices without language, yet full of meaning perceived through breath and pulse, passed down only in whispers. Perhaps that is why so many churches were built atop pagan sites. Not merely to conquer belief, but to imprison it. Then came an old blind nun, her sightless eyes staring into Mahoud as if seeing deep into his bones. She sat still, and by the subtle movement of her hands, Mahoud knew she was praying, not to a familiar god, but to a light she saw in the darkness. Her face was peaceful, but her body frozen, as if time had stopped her at her final breath. Mahoud knew she had not died from wounds. She had given up from the cold and the loneliness, because no one came looking for her, because she did not matter to history, a light that came from within, not above. There was also a child, no older than 10, asleep on the floor. They had all been in that room, in different times, in different forms, but with the same fate. None of them had emerged as ordinary humans. Some may have vanished from records, believed to have died in war, lost in forests, or taken by plague. But truly, they were absorbed by this place, now echoes unspeakable in the world's official stories. Mahoud began to sense that this space was not just a basement, it was a knot, a crossroads of time and consciousness. A door not opened by a key, but by willingness. The willingness to let go of the idea of a straight and logical world. He began to understand that this discovery had been hidden deliberately, not due to physical danger, but because it shook the foundation of reality. Imagine if every old church had such a room. In that stillness, Mahoud began to hear voices. Not whispers, not calls, but the sound of collective consciousness, long waiting. He felt his body grow lighter. Not floating, but shedding something. Like the burden of identity, slowly dissolving. His name became vague. And at that point, Mahoud knew he was not the only one changing. In the depths of that room, Mahoud began to lose all sense of time. He no longer knew how long he had been there, seconds or centuries. But time was no longer relevant, for deeper than time was the experience itself. The dim light filtering through cracks in the ruined ceiling began to fade, and the darkness that remained was not ordinary darkness. It was not emptiness, but a presence so dense it could not be pierced by light. He looked around, and the stones began to appear like skin. Cracks became lines of age. Moss became scars. As if the room itself was a living being, slowly revealing itself. Not from the sun or torches. The light came from within his own body, not literal light. Like children left behind in an empty classroom, hoping someone would return and say they were not wrong, that they too were human, that they too once had a world, but a kind of understanding that ignited a single point of awareness. He saw without eyes, he heard without ears. About prophets meeting light, about hermits seeing truth in a cave. But no one told him that light could also appear beneath an old church in a forgotten space within the body of an ordinary man. He did not know if he was still within a body. He only knew he was listening. Not to voices, but to history unspoken. History not taught. History pulsing like an ancient heart beneath the earth, but because his body began to sync with the rhythm of the place. Through that gap, light emerged. But it was not the light of God. This light was older than religion, softer than fire. It did not spread to illuminate, but to touch. Because the world has become too bright to perceive the true light, too loud to hear the whispers that matter. And Mahoud knew this light came not to explain, but to remind. He did not want to flee, nor did he want to stay. He only wanted to understand. It did not threaten. It did not speak. But it showed. But his vision widened as though crossing dimensions of history. They were those who chose silence, knowing their words would be burned, denied, or buried. He saw the church as it was first built. Stoneworkers hauling fragments from the ruins of an older temple. Upon something that had to be forgotten so the spiritual structure could stand. Mahoud began to understand why the voices whispered. They were remnants of souls never permitted to become part of official history. A priest standing at the altar, reading prayers, while beneath him the ground remained unsealed. Mahoud realized that the light in this darkness did not come from above. In that state, Mahoud suddenly felt himself in a different church. He had not moved physically. Some workers tossed items into the pit that Mahoud now stood in. He saw bones, manuscripts, small idols, and objects from times older than Christianity. But none of it was recorded. All of it was deliberately buried. Partly out of fear, partly in ritual silence. The church had been built not only upon soil, but upon secrets. They were not ghosts. They were ideas left unspoken, thoughts left unwritten. And in this space, they waited, not for revenge, but for recognition. Mahoud felt his hands tremble. Not from fear. He saw the great altar stone above him begin to crack. He remembered the stories he had read as a child. Perhaps all places have such light, but only those quiet enough and lost enough can see it. Mahoud now sat. Mahoud finally understood that what was found beneath this church was not merely bones, ancient objects, or ruins from the past. What had been discovered were fragments of truth deliberately locked away in prayer. Symbols that seemed to originate from older beliefs, more natural, closer to the earth and the body. Silenced through liturgy, left for time to forget. But time does not forget. Time only stores. And sometimes, in strange ways, time opens those ancient drawers again, through people like Mahoud. He touched it with his fingers and felt a faint vibration, like a heartbeat pulsing gently. The voices returned. But now, not as fragmented whispers. Now they sounded like a broken song that still carried rhythm. Within the ruins, Mahoud saw reliefs depicting rituals not meant to worship gods, but to reach the spirits of ancestors. He imagined the priests at the altar, leading mass, reading scripture, drinking wine. But beneath their feet, the ground still echoed with songs older than doctrine. Not by the experiences of the people, but by those seated high enough to interpret the voices below as noise, only remembrance. A human who had gotten lost and found something he could never take home. Mahoud saw figures in his mind, old women carrying torches into caves, children drawing on walls with mud, men sitting in circles reading the stars, all erased from history books, but not from the stones. He looked up, and sunlight began to pierce through the cracked altar above. It was not a sign, not a revelation, merely a coincidence of time, but enough to remind him that he was still in this world, a world where secrets are sometimes found by those who never sought them. He saw it with his own eyes, or perhaps with something deeper than sight. Every faded inch of the walls was a page from a book never published. Every crack in the ground was a sentence crossed out before it could be written. There were carvings on the stones that did not align with church doctrine. He realized the church had been built upon a much older site of worship. And instead of destroying it, the place had been buried in prayer. He thought about how history is written, not by truth, but by power. He moved toward the wall, covered in symbols and shadows. They spoke, not in words, but in feeling. They said that what had been buried was not only bodies, because what he had found was not something that could be filed in a report, not something that could be photographed or written down with a date. It was a subtle vibration between history and myth, but ways of living, ways of thinking, ways of feeling. And now, the world has forgotten them, but not entirely. Mahoud knew he could never explain this to anyone, not to the villagers, not to scholars, not to the church. He imagined the church above him, standing grand with stone pillars and sacred carvings. Those songs did not seek to disturb, did not want reverence. And Mahoud knew he was now part of them, not as a discoverer, but as a listener, a witness uninvited but accepted. When he finally stood, his body felt light, but his soul seemed tethered to that place. When Mahoud emerged from the underground chamber, the world felt different. The sky was still gray. The village remained as silent as always. The wind still drifted lazily through the old trees. But within him, something had changed. He carried nothing from down there. No artifact, no record. Only one feeling he could not discard. That silence cannot be buried. It can only be postponed. He knew that even in their deep sleep, something was knocking from within the earth. But they chose to forget, to bury that strange feeling beneath the church songs, beneath routine, beneath the endless hum of daily life. Mahau did not return home with stories. He didn't speak to the elders. He didn't write a report for the museum. He simply sat on the porch of his small home that evening, staring at the sky that seemed to stare back at him, not as a report, not as evidence, but as a reminder. The local priest merely mentioned restoration work. The villagers, as always, didn't ask much. They were too busy with long days, with the fields, with the boredom that never truly left. No one mentioned the underground room again, as if the sky, too, knew what the earth was hiding. And together they remained silent, like two old souls who had witnessed something too large to say aloud. The world is too harsh to carry mystery, and people too tired to face it. So history becomes like that church, grand above, hollow below, filled with prayers on the surface and silenced voices in the depths. Because in that silence, the truest parts of history hide. A few days later, the church was temporarily closed. No explanation was offered. Of voices forming sentences not in language, but in feeling. He wakes and hears his own heartbeat like an ancient drum. And he knows, though time keeps moving, that voice will remain. But Mahau knew. He knew they had all heard the whisper. He did not blame them. Sometimes at night, Mahau still dreams of those stones, of symbols that move slowly, as if breathing. Not for everyone to hear, but for those who pause, who stay silent long enough to listen, who are empty enough to be filled. He wrote a single sentence in his small notebook. Not everything buried wants to be forgotten. Then he closed the book, blew out the candle, and let the night swallow his house in gentle darkness. The sky slowly closed the day, as if joining in keeping the secret Mahood had found. Shadows of the night crept along the stone walls of the village, brushing old altars and gliding between unmarked graves. He thought of all that was never written in the history books, all the nameless faces, all the stories buried in ruins, all the screams that turned into silent echoes. A world where a child's voice lost underground was not dismissed as illusion. Priests would resume their sermons. Children would run once again in the field near the graves. And no one would ask about the locked chamber beneath the altar. No one would knock on its door. A world where nightmares were archives worth reading. But such a world never existed. He understood now. History never goes to sleep. It only stays quiet. Not from outside, but from within himself. In that darkness, there were no sounds except the soft hush of wind and the faint chime of the church bell. She answered because prayers needed height to reach the sky. But now Mahoud knew the sky doesn't always listen. Because sometimes stillness is the only language the past can understand. Sometimes the sky only holds. Mahoud sat in his old wooden chair, his body still, but his mind moved, slow and unhurried. He remembered asking his mother as a child why the church was so large while their house was small and damp. Outside, the stars appeared dim, as if they too had agreed with the earth to reveal nothing. But among the faint lights, Mahout felt one star staring at him. Not shining, just watching. That night, in his weary thoughts, Mahout imagined a different world. A world where every ruin had a storyteller. Perhaps it was more peaceful to let mysteries remain sealed. But Mahout knew the true lock wasn't made of iron. The lock was collective fear. And the door, it always remained, waiting for those quiet enough to enter. He knew well the night would pass. Dawn would arrive, bringing the same false brightness. Perhaps it was easier that way. He sighed and looked toward the small window in the corner. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to merge. To merge with all the untold stories. With names that lived only in echoes. With stones that wanted to speak. With darkness that wasn't evil, only too honest to be left in light. And in that silence came one final whisper. You know now, so don't leave us behind. He didn't answer. He only stayed still. Imagine you arrive at this village centuries later. The world has changed. Roads are now paved. The old church has become a quiet tourist site, and visitors take photos while staring at their screens. But the ground remains the same. The stones beneath their feet have not forgotten. The hole beneath the altar remains sealed. Nothing is truly opened. Nothing is truly revealed. It is made of deliberate voids, of silence shaped with intention, of wounds left unhealed, so as not to disrupt the polished narrative. Sometimes what is not written matters more than what is printed in official pages. When something wants to speak but has no form to do so. When stones want to tell stories but can only remain mute. They will not speak, they will only listen. And in that silence, a sound may rise that does not belong to the present. A sound with no words, and that wound holds its own language. A language understood only by those who do not come to record, but to feel, but with weight. When history wants to confess, but humans cover their ears with technology and disbelief. A young archaeologist might stand near that old door, recording the temperature, measuring cracks, or placing small finds into sterile plastic bags, replaced by the sound of devices, the steps of tourists, and the glare of cameras. And the secret remains buried, not because it cannot be opened, but because no one truly wants to know. They document everything precisely, but none of their notes capture the strange chill rising from below. They do not record the nightmares that will come that night, a shadow that does not obey the laws of light. They do not understand what it is. They only know it shouldn't be there. But no one listens when they say, I saw something. No one believes the voices of children, just as no one hears the cries from centuries ago. They do not write about the whisper with no source, heard as they breathed inside that space. History is not only made of objects and dates. Imagine a child running down the quiet church corridor, chasing their own shadow. They giggle briefly, then fall silent, because they see something adults cannot, a crack. And in all this, we realize that screaming is not the only form of suffering. Sometimes the most painful is the silence. This church still stands, as it always has, Its bell tower still chimes at the same hour every day, but the voices meant to echo here are gone. Perhaps on one night, when fog drifts slowly and the village is covered in total silence, someone will sit upon the cold altar. And if they are patient enough not to rush, they will come to understand that every place has its wound. Because beneath this church, beyond the stone foundation and rotting wood, not only bodies are buried, but confessions that have long waited to be heard. Sometimes we forget that a church is not only a place of worship, but also a place of storage. Not just for prayers and rituals, but for unspoken memories and untold sins. Its walls absorb more than the echoes of hymns. They hold the warmth of bodies hiding from winter. They retain the scent of blood washed with holy water. Let us imagine you are behind the altar in a narrow space where rotting wood meets ancient stone. Your hand touches a wall that feels like cold skin. There, without a name, someone was once confined, not as punishment, but as erasure. That wall, unnamed and unwritten, never entered official records, but it exists. And it waits, as if the room does not want you inside it. That history does not always take the shape of stories. Sometimes it is just a feeling that lingers. Not from anger, but because too much remains unresolved. A deliberate act to erase a trace. Perhaps a priest who knew too much. Or a woman who carried a dangerous truth. There is no plaque. And anyone who touches it with enough attention will feel that something remains there. Not a ghost, not a spirit, but a presence without words. No record, only a wall holding a secret tighter than iron. Behind that wall, voices could not escape. Breaths were trapped. Days became formless. Time lost its meaning. Only the heartbeat remained, slowly becoming the final song. And after that, silence. But silence does not mean absence. Perhaps one or two of them felt uneasy, but they all knew that questions would prevent the work from being done. So they stayed quiet. And history is built from such small decisions. Silence for the sake of convenience. They might sense something they cannot explain, but they never speak of it. Because who would believe them? When the builders once sealed that part with extra stone, they did it without much discussion. Now, that wall still stands. Slightly shifted from soil-absorbing winter water, yet still solid. People often seek mystery in legends, but true mystery lives in corners unphotographed, in rooms visited only by janitors or bellkeepers. We live in an age of documentation. Everything must have proof, but not all truths can be proven, and not all proofs are truly significant. If you stand there long enough, you might feel breathless. And in that narrow space, where whispers of the past echo in the form of unstable air pressure, you will understand something. At the uppermost part of the church, just beneath the roof where only birds and spring dust ever wander, hangs an old bell. It is suspended on a cracked wooden beam, surrounded by cobwebs and traces of bird feathers. No one has ever rung it. Not even during grand ceremonies or memorials. Perhaps it was rung once to mark a burial without a priest, or to signal the day when the church became no longer sacred. But no one can say for sure. But no hand pulled the rope. Its sound was deep and trembling. And afterward, in the dream, the church floor began to crack, bit by bit, as if something beneath wanted to rise. Even the old records from the bishopric library make no mention of this bell, as if it simply appeared without origin. It is not part of the main bell system. It appears in no church inventory, yet it exists, and has hung there for who knows how long. And like many things in history, sometimes what is most real goes unnamed. Some suspect it is an exile bell, installed for a single purpose, then forgotten. They recorded the building, the altar, old graves, even the faded inscriptions on the walls. But they wrote nothing about the bell, not because they did not see it, but because they sensed it did not wish to be included. There is a collective instinct to leave it alone. And of all the mysteries in this church, that might be the most puzzling. If you stand beneath it, in a room dimly lit by a small high window, you will feel a kind of pressure, as though the air itself refuses to move. Even time seems to hold its breath. The bell with its frayed rope hanging loose seems to observe anyone who enters. It makes no sound, yet gives the sense of watching. But the story continues to be whispered from one caretaker to another, not as a threat, but as a warning not to climb to the loft unless absolutely necessary. An old priest who once served here once said, softly and hesitantly, that he had dreamed of the bell ringing. Of course, no one recorded that dream. And the priest died 20 years ago, buried in a small garden behind the monastery. The bell now remains hanging, surrounded by a silence that feels different. Sometimes the evening light touches it through the glass slits, making its metal glow faintly. But it never sways, never makes a sound. It is like a fragment of history that prefers not to be discovered. Some archaeologists who once visited this church documented everything except one, the unknown bell, unrung, unrecorded, yet still there, hanging in perfect solitude. Behind the main pulpit, hidden from the view of the congregation, there is a small door made of old oak wood. It has no modern handle, just a faintly carved circle, so worn down that it seems to have no temperature when touched. No creak disturbs the silence. The air inside is colder, heavier, as if sealed away from the world for centuries. Light enters through a small window with thick glass, casting strange shapes on the stone floor. It did not say what the room was for, only that there one guards what must not be opened. Inside, there is only a low stone table and a short pine bench that looks as though it has never been moved since it was placed there, and always during the winter months. The walls are bare, except for one smooth stone circle embedded at chest height, polished so flat that it reflects a faint gleam. Not with a modern lock, but with a reworked iron bolt forged by a local blacksmith. The church caretakers agreed never to open it again, not out of fear, but because they have no way to explain it. And perhaps they are more comfortable letting the mystery remain closed, like many things buried by time and silence. For years, people thought it was merely decoration, part of the aging pattern of the church's inner wall. But the door is real, and behind it lies a narrow chamber, a room not included in any official floor plan, not mentioned in the guidebooks, and unknown to most of the monks who once lived within this complex. When the door opens, its hinges make no sound. There are no books, no sign that anyone lived or prayed here. But the room holds a lingering presence, as if someone once sat on that bench for an endless span of time, staring at the blank wall, perhaps waiting for something. The atmosphere here is not frightening, only too still. Others speculate it was a spiritual holding cell, or perhaps a hidden vault for something long lost. But no one knows. When they tried to dig toward the chamber from the outside, the ground became as hard as stone and their tools broke, as if the earth itself refused to be opened. Too quiet, to the point where your head starts to hum. Some say if you sit long enough on the bench, you may begin to hear faint footsteps. Not from within the church, but from beneath the floor. An old manuscript found in a neighboring monastery, written in faded Latin, mentions a cellula interius, an inner cell not to be entered except by one designated person who had taken a vow of silence and would never leave the church until death. Modern researchers disagree. Some argue it was simply an extreme meditation space. Strangely, since the room was reopened in the 20th century, the church clock has occasionally stopped hallways at exactly 3:12 a.m. Not every night, but often enough to be noted. Now, the door is sealed again. There is a confessional chamber not found on the church's plans. It is not positioned near the altar as tradition dictates, but hidden deep within the unused northern wing, veiled behind a stiff, dusty curtain made of old leather. This room lacks the usual wooden booth with a partition grid. Yet the door had supposedly remained sealed since its rediscovery. No record indicated that anyone had access, but faint footprints, child-sized, were found in the dust. Not deep, as if a small figure had walked a few steps and stopped, then vanished in the middle of the room. Some curious visitors have sat inside for an hour, maybe two. They emerge pale eyes, vacant, unable to articulate what they felt. Only one phrase ever leaves their lips, almost a whisper drawn from a dark dream. The voice knows my name. There were no exit marks, no disturbed wall. Instead, it is an open, stone-walled enclosure with a single decaying bench facing a rough wall stained with wax. As though time itself came here to confess. Generations ago, a cleaner stumbled upon it by accident. He followed a strange scent, like burnt incense and crumbling chalk, and noticed a gap in the wall. When he touched it, the stone loosened, revealing this forgotten space. No light entered the room, only remnants of melted candles on the floor, and a faint carving on the wall scratched into the stone like it had been made with a nail. The writing was in a mix of Latin and local dialect. Difficult to interpret, but it spoke of voices behind the walls and whispers that would not cease, no matter how many prayers were uttered. Oddly, the wax was not medieval. Upon inspection, some of the candle remains were modern, produced within the last 2 decades. One priest, years ago, chose to spend a full week in the church, sleeping on the hard bench within this confessional, trying to make sense of it. He emerged with bloodshot eyes and a raspy voice. The church's original construction documents made no mention of it. Even during an 18th century renovation, that section of the building was never marked on any blueprint, as if the room had been created to be hidden or, to contain something that should never come out. He didn't speak much, only saying that there are things not meant to be understood. Then he left the clergy and never returned. His name was removed from the service roster, and any record of him was erased from the church's official archive. Historians tried to trace who built the room and why, but found nothing. Today, the room is not locked, but the leather curtain before it never moves, not even when harsh winds batter the outer wall of the church. Beneath the untouched floor of the chapel, where the faithful once knelt and kissed the cold stone in penance, something remains, never reported to the diocese. During a minor renovation carried out by local workers 20 years ago, a large tile cracked open, revealing a dark cavity below. It was a cryptid, one could even call it, that filled with bones. 2 days later, he was found in his bedroom, eyes wide open, fingers clawing at the wall. No signs of injury, no wounds. But the look on his face did not belong to someone who died peacefully in their sleep. Afterward, the cloth disappeared, and his wife refused to speak of the incident again, ever so gently, like the last breath drawn, or a whisper with no voice. Far too many for one body, not arranged in the respectful manner of consecrated burial. They claimed the earth beneath the chapel was holy and could not be disturbed. Oddly, this contradicted previous permissions granted for excavation on the western side of the building to install water pipes. The only difference, the western wing had shown no signs of burial. They lay jumbled in a heap, fragments of decaying woolen garments clinging between them. Some skulls were small, child-sized. There were no coffins, no tokens of religious ceremony. Just silence and the unchanging scent of damp earth. The workers halted their progress to wait for the priest, but the priest never came. Days later, the project was quietly abandoned. No official report. No explanation. Only whispers passed from one mouth to another. One worker, curious and unwilling to leave questions unanswered, returned alone that night. What he discovered was not a singular grave. He took a piece of the fabric home, intending to show it to anyone in authority. When a group of historical researchers petitioned to drill the floor for an official survey, the church refused. Some believe the bones belonged to victims of plague, buried secretly to preserve the church's reputation. But others, especially those who have heard strange noises near the altar during evening mass, believe otherwise. They say it's not a grave, it's a prison. And those entombed there weren't dead when the stones were laid. They were sealed away, because on certain nights, faint scratching can be heard beneath the tiles, like fingernails seeking a crack, like someone with unfinished words. Today, the broken tile has been repaired, but if you stand there long enough, holding your breath, the floor sometimes trembles. If you enter that old church at night, when a thin mist clings low among the gravestones and the hoot of an owl echoes through a starless sky, there's one strange thing you might notice, but the result only made the difference starker. The unidentified light has a strange hue, slightly bluish, unlike ordinary flame. When approached, it disappears. When ignored, it returns. It doesn't burn like a torch, doesn't flicker like fire. But time doesn't work like that. Candles do not burn forever. That glow is not fire. It is residue, a trace, an echo of something left unfinished. And as long as it remains lit, it means something still endures, or waits. It just is. Hovering, sometimes drifting slowly to the other end of the underground chamber. Even though there's no ventilation and barely any air movement down there. And even though parts of the floor above have since been reinforced with new concrete, the glow still finds a way through the thinnest cracks like a memory that refuses to die. Like a slow breath trailing behind those who wish to forget. A faint light like that of a candle can be seen flickering gently beneath the main altar. Not bright, not enough to illuminate the room, but it's there. Unchanging for years, even when all other lights are off and the doors locked. Some locals call it an optical illusion. Some call it a blessing. But most pretend not to see it. Because who really wants to know that something still glows underground? The church keepers tried masking it by lighting candles around it, hoping to blend the unknown glow with more familiar ones. A bishop once came to investigate, ordering the altar to be cleared and all furnishings moved for inspection. But that day, several sacred items vanished. A dark metal crucifix that used to hang above the entrance was found deep inside a dry old well. No one knew how it got there. The well was locked, with no signs of tampering. The bishop left 3 days later and was never heard from again. No report. No request for follow-up. As if his visit was wiped from the calendar entirely. That light now simply exists. A few curious young villagers once snuck in overnight, trying to camp and record the light with their phones. But when they replayed the footage, only darkness appeared along with a tapping sound. Slow tapping, 3 times, silence, then 3 again. Always the same. They left quietly. None of them uploaded the footage. None tried again. Some in the village believe the glow is from the last candle lit by someone trapped in the underground room centuries ago. Now, the night has fully descended. The wind from the north carries the scent of wet soil and old dust that has clung to the stone walls of that church for centuries. Merely a shelter for what was never welcomed above. The earth beneath holds more than bones and dust. It holds something rejected by history. Something not taught in schools. Not recorded in scripture or king's books. A small buried chamber where voices still cling to the walls, waiting to be heard again by those calm enough to listen. It's just an echo from the past. It won't harm you, only wants to be remembered. The sky above has lost its color, turning into a dark sheet where even the stars hesitate to linger. Not because they fear it, but because they've lived beside it too long. Like an old habit passed down silently, from mother to child, from whisper to whisper. The old church still stands. Its cracks repaired, its wood replaced. But what lies beneath has never moved. It remains there, still and waiting. Like breath in the night, time moves slowly in places like this. Places where history isn't finished. Places where truth never quite rises to the surface. Let the whisper from the half-sealed underground room tell you a story that will never be written in a history book. Because sometimes the truest things are the ones most hidden. And sometimes secrets do not want to be found. They only want to be heard once more in the long quiet of the night. And you, who have listened quietly to this story, may feel your body soften, your breath slow, and your eyes gently close. Imagine that world once more. A world where the old church stands without pride, without praise. In that village, life goes on. Children still play near the stream. Farmers still plant and harvest. No one talks about what lies hidden. And now, as your eyes close and your soul drifts softly toward the edge of sleep, let the voices of the lost age guide you into dreams. Sleep well. And if you wake with a vision of a bluish candle flickering in the corner of your eye, don't be afraid.